Hi, my name is Talia. Welcome to Talia Nerds Out. Just another review video. I finished a few books since I did my last few videos toward the beginning of the month. I'm not sure when these will go up. But I also finished, last time I did a review video, I talked about Sophonisba's Lesson. This time I have The Contagion of Liberty. Now, I'm not sure what the original book jacket would have looked like. It would have been kind of cool to see, but this is still kind of nice. I heard about this from another channel, and I wish I could remember who, because I really thank you for mentioning it on your channel. I really was excited when I heard about it. Darn it, I have a couple of guys that I feel like it is. It's either, I want to say Nick Vadercourt, or I'm not even sure if I got his name. I always get his name wrong. Another guy who I can see in my head, but I can't pull the name out of my head. Anyway, if it's one of you two, or if it's not one of you two and someone else, thank you for bringing this up. I want to say the other one's like Bill something. Darn, I'm just the worst. Anyway, whichever you guys brought this up, thank you. They're very much involved in the Historathon. This was a read for Historathon quarter 3. I did end up going, I think I went a little bit over time on it, but I did end up finishing it. Oh no, I finished it right on time, I think it was. I think I finished it right on time. But yes, I am very happy that they mentioned it. They, I believe, are both Ruttenberg. Bill Ruttenberg, I believe, is the other guy's name. It says either him or Vadercourt, if I got the other guy's name right. I'm terrible. But I feel like it was one of the two of them. They both are involved in having started the Historathon, which is a great booktube all year long read-along. Highly recommend. Like I said, we just finished quarter 3. We have just started quarter 4 at the beginning of October. This was one of my quarter 3 reads, and it was one that I started partway through because that's when I heard about it. So this book is a discussion about it's a discussion on a lot of things actually, but the main topic is the untold battle of getting the smallpox epidemic addressed, and how that, first of all, how this occurred on the backdrop of the Revolutionary War, but not only that it occurred on the backdrop, it influenced the Revolutionary War to occur. That was a very poor way of wording that. It was an influence in the Revolutionary War kicking off. That's a better way of wording that. Anyway, so first of all, I think it is of interest. Well, this is put out by Johns Hopkins University Press, which is, cool. But the other thing that's of interest is this gentleman started researching this book quite a while ago, but coincidentally, he was already starting the writing of it when 2020 happened and the lockdowns and all that. That was not his intention when he ended up writing this. It just sort of happened that way, which is just kind of odd that was the way it worked out. This actually got released in 2022, so I'm not sure if it took him the 2 years to write it, or if it was just the writing and the editing and all that jazz that comes with getting a book published. But yeah, I thought that was interesting, that this is, not only do we have the actual occurrences in this book, we have kind of in the back of our minds, if you actually read the introduction ahead of time, the fact that the author is, while he's writing this, in the middle of a lockdown himself, while he's writing about there being quarantines and stuff in regards to the smallpox smallpox inoculations, and even natural smallpox. Now, at the beginning, there is quite a bit in reinforcing how effective the smallpox inoculations were, how how much of a difference in the number of lives that were lost between the natural smallpox and the smallpox inoculation, and how, I believe I wrote it down somewhere, is like 1% when I did the math. Like 1% of people died with the inoculation, and something like 19 or 20%. I'm going to continue while I'm talking to flip through so I can kind of find that number, because I thought that was interesting that was something that it was that big of a difference. But in spite of that, there were still issues in getting the smallpox inoculations going so that everybody, sorry, I keep trying to look for this number. I wrote it down and everything. But anyway, that was one of the influences in kicking off the Revolutionary War. They talk about the Tea Party, but they also talk about the fact that there were actually riots in regards to the government in the colonies not approving inoculations and just holding off, or they would only inoculate a select few, and the general population would feel like they had been put in danger by not being offered inoculations as well. And now here were these upper class people who weren't keeping to the quarantines as they should, and therefore risking the rest of the community. But yeah, I'm not sure if I'm going to find that number. Like I said, I think it was something like 1% of people who were getting the inoculations versus a quite significant amount of the people who died from natural from natural smallpox. There is also a sad story about how Benjamin Franklin, in spite of being a huge advocate for the inoculations, his son was not inoculated. I'm not sure if they just put it off. There was some talk about whether or not the mother was resistant, but the boy died of smallpox, and it was something that always sat, that really was always a sad, sorrowing point for Franklin, that son died and he really didn't have to die in that way from the disease when he himself was an advocate for inoculation. Well, it doesn't look like I'm going to find that stat. I should have made sure. Okay, so I did find someone else's written down stat. They said this one place, 9% for natural smallpox and only 1.5% mortality rate. I actually saw one place where I did the math, and it was significantly more than that for the natural smallpox, as much as 15 to 20, but that could be an error in remembering. But I do know it's like 1% or even less than 1% for those with the inoculation. So it was highly effective, which is part of what made it so frustrating when people were being denied inoculation, because a lot of times the concern was the effect on the economy. Some of the slave owners were afraid that when their slaves came back from town, they would be infected and bring it back to the plantations. Now, something I did find interesting is the fact that inoculation was something that came to the attention of the Americas because actually of a slave, and that was something that they tried to suppress as much as possible. First of all, because you had a slave who told it to a sailor, who he was the one who started telling doctors and such. Now you had two. They didn't want the slave to get credit, absolutely. They also didn't want this lower class sailor to get credit. So they did as much as they could to suppress both of their names in the narratives of of the story of inoculation. And inoculation was something I accepted a lot quicker in America than it did in Britain, much to British doctors' dismay. And Americans got to the point where they embraced inoculations as being a thoroughly American thing. And I think that's why it got so tied up into the patriotic fervor that went behind the revolution. This was an American thing. They were being denied this by the British. Not only were their rights being infringed upon with these taxes, their health was being put at risk by inoculations being denied. So it was this whole interesting combination of things, with the smallpox epidemic and the inoculation question being one that had a lot more of an influence than it's rarely ever talked about. I've never heard it as part of the conversation. Apparently it was a huge influence. One of the other things that I found interesting is that Washington often gets credited for bringing inoculations to the Revolutionary Army. And while he ended up having influence in that later on, he was actually highly resistant to it for quite a while. He was under the belief, almost to the point of pure paranoia, that the British were trying to infect the American soldiers with smallpox. And he was thoroughly against getting inoculations among the soldiers, to the point where there were penalties threatened, and people were going and sneaking around and getting each other inoculations, getting each other smallpox matter so they can do illicit inoculations among the soldiers, which of course didn't always work out well because you couldn't quarantine safely because, you weren't supposed to be inoculating. So it caused its own issue, caused a huge issue in the army that went up by Canada, and it didn't do much to help with the paranoia about the British and smallpox epidemic being promoted by them, especially among the slaves that they had taken who ran away to join the British Army with hopes of freedom. And a lot of the plantation owners believed that they were intending to get the slaves sick with smallpox and then return them to plantations. And there were occurrences where the slaves caught smallpox and the British Army didn't want to take them on, and they did end up returning to the plantations and had to be quarantined. And I believe that usually you had to then look at everyone else being inoculated. But whether or not there was really an intent there, it does seem to be a lot more likely for it to be some paranoia that ended up unfortunately affecting the revolutionary soldiers getting the inoculations they needed. Which is interesting because Washington knew that if you had been exposed to smallpox, you would not be at risk of getting smallpox again. So, because he had smallpox when he was younger, he knew that it had, prevented him from getting smallpox. He had been known to ask for soldiers who had already had smallpox and been exposed to it for certain missions. So he knew that it was important, but he still was resistant to it. Later on, I think it was after Martha went and got at least herself and her children inoculated, went to town for that. It was around that time period where Washington started having his mind changed. And he eventually got to the point where he not only was a firm advocate among the soldiers and insisting that this was something that needed to be done, but he also was saying that he thought every man, woman, and child in Virginia should be inoculated. So he went from being very strongly against inoculations to being very fervently pro-inoculation, even though he wouldn't necessarily have forced it among the civilians. That was his belief that it should be something that people should do. This was not a very popular thing in the South. Inoculations messed up with the plantation work, and a lot of the plantation owners were just not into that. So a lot of times, the only reason why slaves would get inoculated, unless you had a particularly, you know, I guess compassion, as much as you can be compassionate if you were a slave owner at the time. I mean, I believe they did think that they were being compassionate, some of them. So if you end up being the right person owning you, they would actually, that sounds terrible, they would actually be more likely to get the inoculation regardless as to whether or not there was risk of exposure to the entire plantation, whether or not there was a concern for that. So you might have some people just bringing their personal slave to town and getting them inoculated just because they either felt that was the right thing to do or whatever. I believe I had read about someone bringing a young woman and her child. I think sometimes you would see that for some of the house slaves, or they wanted to avoid some of the severe scarring that might occur with the more natural smallpox. But it was a lot harder if you were looking at getting a full plantation inoculated. There was a lot of pushback. And that's where the conversation started coming in of economics versus the inoculations, which would inevitably cause there being I keep wanting to say lockdown, but quarantine, that's the word I'm looking for. And how difficult it could be in certain cases to enforce quarantine, where you almost had like a level of people spying on each other when they weren't supposed to be, when they had not yet been given permission to have the inoculation. So you'd have people spying on each other to make sure they weren't stealing smallpox matter to get inoculated against the rules, and them putting everyone else at risk when there wasn't a quarantine in effect, and there hadn't been a permitted inoculation period for like a town-wide, citywide, whatever, inoculation, a general inoculation. So this conversation that occurred back then of economy versus quarantine was one that was highly contested prior to the Revolutionary War and after the Revolutionary War. And it really is a conversation that has remained relevant today with the post the 2020 COVID lockdowns. You had that conversation of, okay, when we've been locked down for so long, now people are going to start running out of money, the economy's being affected. Okay, when is too long? When is just enough time? It's a conversation that dates way back when. You see it even back when you're dealing with smallpox, which I thought was interesting. I think I'm going out of order for my notes. One thing that I thought interesting, I mentioned that America was ahead of the curve when it came to the inoculation, at least in comparison to Britain, but we were behind the curve when it came to the vaccine. And that has a lot to do with how the vaccine ended up reaching us in America. So we had a doctor who, even during inoculation periods, way back, before the Revolutionary War, was talking back and forth with the British doctor. And after the war, when Jenner had discovered, the fact that cowpox could, prove helpful as a vaccine for smallpox, after that had all been discovered, this British doctor talked to the American doctor, was like, hey, there's this thing, and the American doctor's like, great, that's cool to hear, can you get me some of that? Now, unfortunately, rather than sharing this very important knowledge and making the matter available to other doctors, the smallpox, the vaccine matter available to other doctors, he decided to capitalize upon it and corner the market. And if other doctors wanted it, he would charge them where they'd have to pay him for the rights to the vaccine. And so you had this monopoly going on where it was really only something that could be afforded the vaccine could only be afforded by people of wealth. And, this was something that was very much appreciated in the South, where, since there's no need for quarantine, business can continue as usual. Now, the people who were hurt by this were the poor who couldn't afford to pay and the slaves, because, we don't have to worry about getting sick ourselves if we're vaccinated, so no need to, we'll vaccinate ourselves, and, as long as no one in the plantation catches smallpox, business as usual, no need to inoculate everybody. We'll just, keep ourselves to ourselves on our plantation. So it really wasn't good for the slave population or the poor, at least not at the beginning, until you had doctors who started pushing for, it was not only doctors, there were doctors, some politicians. Jefferson could have pushed more. He helped spread it a little bit, but really it was this small town, I believe it was called Milton, that did a lot to push the idea of getting vaccines, making that available to everybody, not just limiting it. Milton, I remember that correctly. And it's a shame that this landed in the hands of Dr. Waterhouse instead of someone like Dr. Rush, who had been known during other epidemics like yellow fever. First off, for yellow fever epidemic, Rush stayed when other doctors fled Boston. I'm sorry, not Boston, Philadelphia. And Rush was known to provide necessary medications, etc., through like a free pharmacy, or at least provide these aspects of these necessary treatments to the poor for free. So if someone like Rush had been the one to get this vaccine, there would have been no hoarding of it in the way that there had been for Dr. Waterhouse. Unfortunately, Rush did not end up, and a lot of other doctors did not end up embracing the germ theory as quickly as they could have. So there were, unfortunately, just getting things like yellow fever addressed the way they should have been took longer than it could have. But anyway, so where was I? I mentioned how vaccines really, they didn't get to who they needed to because of who was the one to receive it. And he really wanted to be known as the Jenner of the United States. Now, eventually, people realized that he was in it for the money, and he had to work very hard to try to elevate his reputation again, because his reputation was completely ruined for all he had done to try to keep that the benefits of the vaccine to himself and to anyone who could pay him for it. Later on, he did everything he could to spread the vaccine, to everyone, to try to clear his name a bit, but he had already done the harm by doing everything he could at the beginning to capitalize on it and not make it available to other doctors. Then also other conversations that are opened by this book besides the economy, how you deal with the economy versus dealing with the public health. How do you balance those two things? Because people also need to be able to make money in order to live, but their health needs to be, there's this whole, it's not an easy conversation to have. It's a nuanced conversation. Then there's another question that comes, a conversation that can be had based off of some things in the book, of how much can and should a government regulate in regards to public health. And you see this particularly when you're dealing with inoculations, whether or not people were allowed to inoculate, when the enforcement of the quarantines post-inoculation, because, you had to, because you could spread it. If you've been inoculated, you could still spread it. It was live. It just wasn't it was in a smaller amount than if you caught it naturally. So when and if inoculations / vaccines in a more modern case should be mandatory, and how should the needs of the poor be addressed? Because a lot of times the poor were the ones who were affected, the poor, and in the case of back then, the slave population. So this book, it goes beyond telling a history that has practically been erased. It was erased in an attempt to put more of a focus on vaccines, an attempt to discourage inoculations when towns started trying to go back to inoculations when they realized only the rich were able to get the vaccines. They were trying to do everything they could to erase the inoculations and its hand-in-hand relationship with the Revolutionary War, to the point that it really doesn't get told until, I've never heard told outside this book. So this book, besides telling that story, it also raises questions and prompts conversations that are still relevant today, ones that are complex with no easy answers, but ones that should be discussed, ones that are just important to think about. Like I said, when do we look, how much time can we go in a quarantine before the economy is severely affected? Which it's not something to be sneered at, because the economy affects everybody, just like public health affects everybody. So that balancing act is very challenging, and making the right decisions can affect a lot of people. As is how the poor will be taken care of, as is how there's quite a few conversations that this book suggests. So I do recommend reading this. If you're interested in public health, if you are interested in the Revolutionary War, and especially if you're interested in the idea of the Revolutionary War and an aspect of the Revolutionary War that does not get discussed the way that it should. And then, like I said, finally, the conversations that this book suggests, especially in light of recent history that we experienced back in 2020, and which we still feel the repercussions of to a certain extent now. So, yeah, like I said, I recommend this book. Thank you to whoever it was who got this book and sparked my interest. I did very much enjoy this. I will probably read it again. There was just, a lot that I learned from this. So, yeah. I hope that you look up this book. Hope that you find that you will enjoy it as much as I did. Thank you very much for joining me today. Hope that you have a very wonderful day, and I will see you for the next video. God bless. Bye.